Welcome once again to Bearing Witness as Protest. As you heard from Nico upstairs, this has really been a collaborative project for us. Tonight's program is a part of a neighborhood-wide week-long AFROPUNK Takeover of Harlem, celebrating alternative Black culture and exploring its ties to instances of resistance. So as we transition to this next part of our program, I really wanted to take a moment and just shout out our partners, AFROPUNK and Harlem Stage, who have done a really amazing job of bringing together all of these great Harlem institutions and activists, artists, cultural producers to really engage around contemporary thought and issues of identity, art, and protest. And they've done so in a variety of ways, ranging from discussions on Black joy as an expression of resistance to paying homage to the tradition of protest and song. And so if you haven't, I really encourage you all to check out the rest of the roster. We have brochures upstairs available for that as well. It's going on, it started a couple of nights ago and it's going on through Saturday. So I would get in where you fit in. Tonight's panel really, as a part of that lineup, is meant to just add yet another dimension to that conversation and exploring the role of visual art as well as the scholarship and activism around it in engaging issues of social justice and resistance. And as again, Nico said upstairs, we really have an amazing panel of fearless women here with us tonight doing the work, boots on the ground, and so I'm really excited to hear from them and a little bit more about their work. We thought that the best way to do that would be to actually have them speak on what they're doing now a little bit before you hear them in conversation with each other. And so first up, we're actually gonna have our moderator, artist, scholar, and writer, Chaédria LaBouvier. And so Chaédria is a contributing editor for Elle.com, New York Magazine, and the brand Bevel. She's also the co-founder of Mothers Against Police Brutality, which for her really came out of a moment of losing her brother in September of 2013 to police brutality. In March of 2013 to police brutality. And her most recent work really brings together all of her interests in culture, issues of state violence and art through a scholarly unearthing of Basquiat's 1983 painting, Defacement, or the Death of Michael Stewart. And I won't say much else because she's going to do an amazing job of covering that herself, but I will say that even in putting this panel together, her scholarship really helped our team sort of understand the issues that we were trying to cover and understand through this panel as part of a tradition of artists processing and responding to these issues. And I think at a time where I hear more and more people saying now more than ever, it's great to sort of contextualize these practices in a tradition, in understanding that the issues that we're facing have in many ways always been present, and so have been the voices of resistance against them. And so with that, I'm going to hand the mic over to Chaédria.
Hello. Hello, my name is Chaédria LaBouvier, and I'm a writer and activist and Basquiat scholar, which is a very tall thing to say in Thelma Golden's house. So as Rachel kind of began, my scholarship and activism and work around police brutality really came from a very personal place. I lost my brother to police violence, state violence, in March of 2013. And on a personal level, that has been the most devastating and traumatic thing that I've ever experienced. And so what that told my mother and I, because it was devastating for her as well, is that we unfortunately were not the only persons that this happened to. And so we founded Mothers Against Police Brutality to really collectivize and organize and activate that what was happening on the ground, and really trying to engage institutions and policies and people And so I'm not involved on the day-to-day with that so much anymore, but I am aware of what they're doing. My activism then went back to journalism, and so I've been a contributing writer at Elle, and most of my work on police brutality in the mainstream has been there. And working and writing for Elle, I was one of the first, if not the first, to write about police brutality in mainstream women's magazines, which then started a chain reaction of magazines such as Vogue and Marie Claire and Cosmopolitan also writing and covering it. And also it started this much bigger conversation about decolonizing those spaces. And then in addition to that, the work that I'm doing right now is scholarship on Basquiat's painting Defacement, The Death of Michael Stewart, and really putting that painting into a context of not just state violence, but what does Michael Stewart mean? Michael Stewart has, by, let me see if I can. So this is the painting of The Death of Michael Stewart, and it's a largely unknown painting of Basquiat's, but I am very passionate about the fact that I believe it to be his most important work at the moment and his most topical. And sort of a bit of background about this painting is that he did this in 1983. We think October of '83, after Michael Stewart was murdered by the transit police in New York City on First Avenue on the L stop. And so why Michael Stewart is important is, you know, he started this contemporary conversation about police brutality in New York that has been largely forgotten. And in the 80s, it was a really traumatic and seismic event, and a lot of artists responded to it. Jean-Michel Basquiat did this painting, but Keith Haring also did his own painting. And Spike Lee also commented on Michael Stewart's death and Do the Right Thing. The death scene of Radio Raheem is a commentary on Michael Stewart's death. Michael Stewart is also the reason why the chokehold is banned by the NYPD, allegedly. And so part of my scholarship has not only been breaking down this painting technically, but also understanding what does Michael Stewart mean and what place do we owe him in art history. And so this is also another, it's a silk screening that my research is also about, which right now I'm about 80% sure that this is also about defacement. It's largely just been attributed to my Basquiat's obsession with anatomy, but when you actually start breaking this down and looking at the time and looking at the injury, and looking at the pieces of anatomy the parts of anatomy that he's highlighting, they very closely parallel Michael Stewart's injuries. And so I've recently had a chance to talk to the printer of this and to confirm a couple of key pieces of information that's really exciting. So this is also the next step of my research, is putting together a scholastic and visual narrative of why these two are connected. And this is a photo of Michael Stewart. This is the photo that exists and percolates in the public imagination and also in the public discourse. But I brought this up because this is really the only photo that is available if you Google Michael Stewart. And this is the photo that his family released when he was murdered, but this is actually what he looked like when he died. So this is kind of a difficult photo in that this is a photo of pins that his family sent me. I recently finished teaching a course on Basquiat, and also I worked and collaborated with the Williams College Museum of Art to bring the painting there, where it was the subject of discourse, scholarship, and programming. And so that was the painting's first, its second showing in the US. It's only had 5 showings, and it was the first in 15 years. And so, thank you. Thank you. And so, I thought that this was important. These were pins that I passed out on the last day to my students that his family sent over, and I thought it was important to show this photo. This photo of him doesn't exist in the public discourse yet, but this is a photo of what he actually looked like when he was murdered, and he also looks a lot more like Basquiat. And so it puts another context and layer to the very famous phrase, "It could have been me, it could have been me," that Basquiat is known to have said about Michael Stewart in this event. And it also raises this very important question of erasure, not to in any way to judge his family, but I also think that they knew the way in which dreads were pathologized in 1983. And so it was a very conscious decision to choose an older photo, but a less threatening, so to speak, photo of Michael Stewart at the time of his death. And so I think that that's also important to unpack, and I think we owe Michael Stewart that. And the last leg of, well, not the last leg of my research, because I'll be doing this for a couple of years, but I think the next step is collaborating with museums across the country to bring this painting and other paintings that are related to it so that it can have the wider audience that it deserves.
Thank you for that, Chaédria. And so up next, we're going to be hearing from Oasa DuVerney, who we heard a little bit from upstairs, and as you know, is exhibiting a piece here as part of the window and the breaking of the window. But that's really just one of many shows of talent that she has. And so Oasa has exhibited at Rush Arts Gallery and as part of the Brooklyn Biennial at Brick. She's also been awarded many residencies, including the Rush Philanthropic Foundation residency, the Smack Mellon residency, and then one at Lower Manhattan Cultural Center. But besides all of these accolades, I was personally really struck by her commitment to her community and using her talents and vision as an artist to sort of work through some of the issues that Chaédria brought up in her own work as well. And so without further ado, here comes Oasa.
Hi, I'm Oasa. Oh, there we are. I'm Oasa DuVerney. So if you were here earlier when we were upstairs, I talked a little bit about the Renisha McBride portrait that is on view here, being part of a larger body of work that I was making and probably will continue to make in response to the death of Renisha McBride. This is actually the first drawing that I started in response to her death. It was a very, very visceral feeling for me when I learned of it, and I wanted to do something, and I didn't know what to do because I didn't have any way of really responding to it in a way that would help. And the only thing I could think of was to draw, because that is the tool I've always used to process life, just as a person. So I just got a really large piece of paper, and I rolled it out and pinned it in my hallway, because I don't have a studio, because New York City sucks, for many reasons. And I just went to town on it, and I just started drawing, and it wasn't trying to draw any particular thing. But again, I was thinking of the screen and Theodore Wafer not seeing Renisha for who she was. And I decided in that moment, or in a moment while drawing it, that Black women are like the universe. We're here, we're everywhere. You need us. But you don't see us in your everyday lives. You don't notice us. We're invisible to you. And so I wanted to black out the universe and also create it at the same time in this drawing. And when I was done with it, I felt like I wasn't really done with it. It took me about 9 months, so the better part of a year to make the drawing. So I decided to just deny and confirm the existence of the universe the same way that Black women are denied and confirmed every day. So that's that drawing. Do I go? Oh, thanks. This is another. Sorry. I don't know if you guys can hear me or not, depending on how close I am. But if at any point you can't hear me, just say you can't hear me, and I'll just shout. So this is another drawing I made in response, and it is a Black Cross flag for Renisha McBride, and it is to symbolize the help that she never received, the help that we often don't receive. I don't know about you guys, but it's really hard to call the police when the police are the problem. You can't call 911 on them. So this idea of just symbolically confirming that there is no help, but also wanting there to be help. So that's that. I'll move on. I've got probably 5 minutes at this point. So these two drawings I started making this past year kind of came out of the first Renisha portrait, and the series is titled The View from Nowhere. And again, it's still on screens. And this idea of the view from nowhere, simultaneously referencing the marginalized, people who are discarded and unseen, and also the neutrality of being white and male, believing that because you don't have issues with race or gender, those things don't affect you, and therefore you can kind of move throughout the world in spaces without being negatively impacted or having some sort of response that would influence you, which is bullshit. So this is Julian Assange and also Diamond Reynolds, and I always like putting them together because I feel like they did a lot of the same work. Obviously, Julian Assange is more respected than Diamond Reynolds. If you guys don't remember Diamond Reynolds, she was the woman who live streamed her boyfriend after he was murdered by the police in Minnesota, Philando Castile. So she was a hero to me and probably to a lot of other people. So I just wanted to honor her that way. Here's a drawing of an eagle eating my brain. That's how I feel about imperialism. And so the eagle eating my brain, and also this drawing that is called Offshoring. I started making this work basically because I decided that I was annoyed and fed up with this idea of, because I'm a woman and an artist of color and Black, that I have to make work about these issues by putting my body or other Black bodies on display and having it debated. And I didn't want us to debate it anymore in that way. It annoyed me that the other is never debated. No one is ever questioning how valid they are or aren't. And the first way I responded to that, and I'm sorry I didn't bring a drawing for that, was to start a portrait series of white men. But then I got sick of drawing them. So I decided that I was going to make drawings about Black power. So this is one of my first drawings about Black power. So just using images from nature that are very powerful and making them Black. Which brings me this image. So outside of my regular drawing practice, I also do this public project with my friend and neighbor, who's also an artist, Mildred Beltry. She's right over there. So in 2010, we started just going outside and making art with our neighbors and for our neighbors, and just hanging out and having fun. And here we are. That summer in particular, we were offering our services, our art services. So I was doing a portrait service, and Mildred was doing a sewing and mending service. And this is one of our neighbors who's waiting for her crop top. What? They're important. Here's another action scene. We did a lot of screen printing. And so everything gets set up outside, and it's kind of starts off in this way of where we're showing people how to do things, and then eventually they take over and they're kind of running the show and we're just assisting. So we kind of go from artist to artist assistant, which is a lot of fun. And here are some happy customers with their Rent Strike Now posters. I thought if we made Rent Strike Now posters that maybe our block would go on a rent strike. We didn't. We also do this really cool thing in the middle of our block where there's a bridge. We weave messages into the fence and we change the message every year during the summer. And here are some people who decided that they were going to help us. Here's one of the messages that we had. It says, "Do more, hope less." Some people thought it said hopeless. They were wrong. Here's another one. This is actually a Victor Hugo quote that Mildred found from a Martin Luther King Jr. speech. And it says, "The guilty ones are not those who commit the sins, but those who create the circumstances." And it's true. Here's another action shot. Here's another one. It says, "Do not disappear." Into silence. There's a car blocking it, but it says into silence. And here are some other happy customers who are still here. Here's a poster I made. So Mildred and I, aside from the work that we've been doing with our neighbors, over the years we realized that gentrification in housing was a serious problem. We made this book for free. It kind of works like the phone book where we just drop it off. And you can have it, but it is a guide to tenant rights and community activities. So it just kind of simplifies the state's information and then also has really cool graphics and some activities. Doing that was great, and we started getting invited to participate in exhibitions and kind of these art spaces, but we realized the work that we were doing with our neighbors doesn't really translate into the art world, and it just seemed more voyeuristic than anything interesting. So we decided that we were going to respond directly to the art world, and so we decided to make a Gentrifiers Anonymous meeting and to create 12 steps to being less of the problem. And this is one of the posters from the 12 steps, and it says, "Just be decent." It's actually really hard for some people. Here's another one. It says, "Acknowledge the exact nature of your wrongs." Also a difficult task for some. And then make a fearless moral inventory. And then, destroy capitalism. And reject the colonizer mentality. Obviously, that's a challenge here. This is an installation shot, and I'm done. All right. Sorry.
Do I really have to follow that? Hi, I'm Jess. My visuals are essentially non-existent in comparison. But I just want to thank you all for being here and thank the Studio Museum for having us. So I'm with Harlem CopWatch. Here we are. This is my one visual, so enjoy it, right? Take the time, pretend like it's doing something for you artistically. I'll pretend like it was meant to, and we'll proceed from there. So just to talk a little bit about CopWatch, I actually want to move it into a space of thinking about cop watching, right? Because when you think about, I'm a cop watcher, it becomes a title, right? It becomes a little bit separated from your everyday life or what you can do. Oh, Jess is in cop watch, but me, I'm just, I'm going to work, I'm doing my thing. No, it's something that we try to work to make a part of the culture of our communities. And to think a little bit historically about it, its roots are actually not here in New York, but in the South, right? And in the South, in the early part of the 20th century, when Black communities were facing lynchings really, really frequently, right? So communities organized to defend themselves against white supremacy. What did that look like? It looked like being armed, right? So that's kind of the roots of cop watching. Most of us are familiar, of course, with the Black Panthers. I'm sort of institutionalizing it a little bit, and Black Panther processes of cop watching with guns, right? Trying to ensure some kind of limits on the state powers of white supremacy and violence. So here we are now with cameras, right? So cop watching is constitutionally protected practice of monitoring and documenting police activity. That's all it is, right? That's you pulling out your phone when you see a stop that looks like it's going sideways, right? That's live streaming your partner's murder, right? That's all cop watching. So there are different ways to do this, right? You can do this on an organized patrol, as we do in Harlem Cop Watch. You can do it individually. You can do it situationally, right? It's all part of cop watching and all part of the culture. And I realize now that I'm talking about this a little bit institutionally, how did I get into this? I had no choice, really, right? So growing up, there's no escape from police violence. Literally, I was trying to think about this earlier this week. Some of my earliest memories in life are of police brutality, right? Remember one summer when I was about 5, walking from the park with my brother. He was about 12 at the time, right? And having the police throw him down on the ground, right? Just a 12-year-old boy, walking his sister home from the park. So that's been my whole life. When I was a little bit older, but not too much, they shot Amadou Diallo around the corner from my home, right? For those of you who weren't in New York City at the time or might not remember, it was a man who was shot 41 times by undercovers, right? They later found that the first bullet killed him, right? Entered his chest, shredded his aorta. There are bullet holes in the bottom of his feet, right? Is there any level of this violence that's acceptable? No, but there's a particular kind of choreography to the ways in which we're slaughtered, right? And I think we've all kind of touched on that. So back to cop watching. Harlem Cop Watch is part of something called the CopWatch Alliance, right? Which is a bunch of different patrols in different parts of the city, right? All over the city, in Brooklyn and Queens, and all over the place. We ourselves are now moving beyond strictly cop watching into a more organizational role. And I don't mean sort of NGO industrial complex stuff. I mean that we realize, obviously, that the roots of white supremacist state violence are much deeper and have many more manifestations than just police brutality. So thinking about gentrification, right? Thinking about displacement, thinking about all the broken windows policies through which we're brought in. And also, and this is something that's very important to me, I had a piece out about this recently in Race Baiter, thinking about organization in prison, right? And the fact that we talk about people getting arrested or murdered by police, but we sort of stop talking about them once they're incarcerated. Like they're not part of our community anymore, right? And like the most important ideas don't always come from prison. Like the people who aren't the furthest from the structures of power don't always have the best ideas about how to bring down those structures of power. So I can talk more about that later. That's the direction we're going. See, more words. We try to, I know, I should have coordinated this better. We try to think about cop watching as having 3 Ds and 3 Es, right? So what can cop watching do? It can deter, right? And we've seen this happen. So for example, last week at about 3 in the morning, I'd been out with friends. I was walking my friend to the 456 on 125th and Lex. That's my neighborhood. How many of y'all know that corner? Okay, so you know what I'm talking about, right? For those of you who aren't familiar with that corner, it's an express stop. It's a very important transit hub. We used to have a Pathmark there, a 24-hour grocery store, union-owned and operated. They shut that down about 1.5 years ago. They're going to put luxury condos in there, shut down some other spaces. There's a lot of people who don't have housing who are in that area, and a lot of people who have substance and mental health issues in that area. A lot of methadone clinics in the neighborhood, right? So the police are trying to push everyone out. Now there's a mobile command unit that's there 24/7, bright lights, continuous presence. And for those of you who might have ever, if you search for the hashtag occupied territories on Instagram, you can see a long photography series I've been doing on this for a couple of years. So anyway, I was at this intersection, and the police basically antagonized a man till he got frustrated to the point of putting garbage down the stairs And then they were trying to move in on him, right? I was there with a friend, we started filming, and he was saying, the only reason y'all aren't moving on me is because they're there. Thank you, sister, right? And then he kept talking more. I'm like, cállate, stop talking. Like, less is more right now, it really is. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But there is a deterrent effect. Not always, right? There's no magical alchemical formula we can give you as cop watchers to make the cops stop murdering us. There isn't. And that's the reality. But it can work as a deterrent in some circumstances. De-escalating, right? Just the presence of other people who are trained and who know the rights can sometimes de-escalate the level of violence. And then, of course, documenting, right? A record. Someone goes to court, right? Being able to use that as evidence. Look, the cops tried to say I was doing this and that, but I wasn't. Through a completely, it's not even imperfect. The court system is working exactly as it's meant to, right? And we can talk about that more. So there are problems with all of these. I want to acknowledge that. And then the 3 E's, and this is very important to me: educate, engage, and empower the community, right? So we're always, every time we're on patrol, every time we're out in the streets, we're always having conversations about people know your rights. When the police stop you, ask them, am I free to go? Am I being detained? Right? What's the difference between a frisk and a search? Right? What can you do? So we're always working to do that, and that's very important to us. And then just my brief moment of education for you all. 3 levels of police street encounters. So what happens? What happens when the cops stop you? So the first one is when they're trying to stop you. You know how this works, right? That initial approach. How many people in here have been stopped in the last month? Nope, just me. All right. Don't do what I do, then, is answer. All you want to say is, am I being stopped? Am I free to go? Right? That's all you want to say. Again, less is more, engage less, right? They say, yes, you're being stopped. It's a difference between when you're stopped, they can frisk you, right? They can touch the outside of you. They can't go into your pockets. They can't look in your bag. They can't look under your scarf, under your hat. They'll try to get you to do this, right? Oh, that's a nice hat there. Can I see? Why don't you just, you don't want any trouble. I can see you're late to pick up your kids. Just let me look in your bag, ma'am, and then you can be on your way. The good cop, right? Second level, I do not consent to this search. It's critical. I do not consent to this search. And then lastly, hopefully it doesn't get here, you're being stopped. You're being arrested. The only thing to say at that point, I'm invoking my right to remain silent, because they will use everything against you. Oh man, I was just coming from the bodega. I was on my way to pick up my kids. Nothing, right? There's no innocent communication with violent agents of white supremacist state power, right? There's no innocuous interaction. There's no, I'm just looking for directions. Right? I'm invoking my right to remain silent. Yeah, I don't have a nice wrap up, but if you would like to get involved, please do contact us. We have Facebook, we have an Instagram, right? And the next training we're running is going to be in the Heights on March 13th, so you'll get a much more detailed explanation of know your rights. We're organizing rapid response, right? So how many of you live in Harlem? How many people live in the Bronx? Brooklyn? Yeah, so we've all had our projects gang rated, right? Gang rated. We're trying to organize around that. Rapid response networks also for ICE, which is a huge threat to many people in our community. So if you are interested in that, please contact us or please come and talk to me after this. I'd love to get you involved, because at the end of the day, we're all we have, right? And we know this, and we've known this in different iterations, you know. There was Steve Biko's highly gender problematic, black man, you're on your own kind of thing, right? But we know what that is and we know what that means. And there's no sort of institutional route out of this, right? There's no reform. There's no, if they pass this law or overturn that law or elect this person or, you know, impeach that person, changing the casting doesn't change the system. Right? And we've been knowing that. And we've been knowing that it's working really efficiently and exactly as it's meant to. It's not broken, right? they're breaking our communities, but their system is intact and working very, very well. So if we want to think about doing something different, if we want to think about our survival right now, right, but how we could flourish, how we could actually imagine a different future outside of a reaction, we're all we have. So please come talk to me if you're interested in organizing with us. Even if you're not in Harlem, I can hook you into different, CopWatch patrols in different parts of the city. So thank you.
Hello. So we'll go ahead and get started with the talk. And how are we doing on time? Okay. So we'll try to get through these questions and keep them concise so that we have ample time for the Q&A. So I like to take this idea of art as evidence. And this really comes from, so I have to give credit to the collector of defacement, and she had this brilliant observation that this painting in 1983 was a form of evidence. This is before video cameras, which is such a big part of cop watching. What does that mean to have art as evidence, and what does that mean in an age where we have cameras and we have modern ways of documenting this, but in a court of law, even when there is evidence, that's still not enough to get a conviction. It's still not enough to even get to the grand jury. So I'd really like to ask you guys, what does art as evidence mean for you as an artist, and what does it mean for you as an activist?
Sorry. For me, it means a lot of different things. Like I was saying earlier, I am not good at a lot of things, but I know I'm good at drawing. I know I'm good at making art, or I feel confident that I can do that versus, I don't know, algebra. So that's where I feel comfortable responding to things and processing things. And the art that I make alone in my studio space, obviously that doesn't really have much of an audience outside of it being exhibited or posting it online or something like that. But what you're saying makes me think a lot about the work that I do publicly with Mildred. And when we started, we didn't know what it was going to be. We were connecting with each other as neighbors in our building. We were having drawing and sewing nights, and we wanted to take it out into the street and share that experience of building a deeper friendship with the rest of our community. We just went out there and we did it. And over time, we realized that what we were doing actually meant more than just the art making. And that, yes, we were building community, but also we were acting in resistance to the idea that there is something illegal or something bad about the sight of Black and brown bodies in public spaces. Working in art education, I've done a lot of after-school programs, and a lot of these organizations, their main goal is to keep Black and brown youth off the street, to keep them out of trouble, which is such bullshit to me. They're criminalizing our kids from the beginning. And what we were doing by being outside and being Black and reclaiming our sidewalks as places for creativity and for love and for caring, I think that's our protest. I think that's how we're resisting, and we'll continue to resist by being out there and being around for our community, and just making ourselves useful as artists. It's so easy to get wrapped up in the market and the art world and trying to make these connections or making a sale, but really, it doesn't mean anything. I shouldn't say that. I'm sure it means something, but it doesn't. It doesn't mean as much to me as the work that we're doing in our neighborhood.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, and obviously we don't want to get into some hyper-philosophical conversation about what art means, right, and what activism means. But I think that art as a sustained practice of creating community, and when you were articulating that, that really spoke to me, you know, and that's something we're doing, right, because the public was all fine until we asserted our right to be a part of it, right? The idea of public anything, you know, and anyone who's a student of history knows this, public parks, public schools, public, you know, swimming pools were all good until we became part of that public, right? And then that's where all the money started getting sucked out. So by being very public, right, by being on the streets, documenting these activities, educating people, you know, intervening when the cops are trying to say, you can't film. It's a constitutionally protected right, which standing on the Constitution is exactly as problematic as it sounds, but that is something, right? And that's something that asserts a kind of possibility for people in the community who are very scared all the time, right? I don't know how many of us realize what a part of our baseline existence terror is, right? And why words like terrorism don't really register with people in our community in the same way, because we're like, in comparison to what, right? Like literally, what does that mean? How could it be any scarier all the time when you don't know? And so by creating in that space, right, because that's supposed to be the first thing that goes away when your life is in peril, is your capacity to create. I think that's essential, right? And we were talking about this a little bit before. You know, most of my experience with art is street art, right? It's tagging and it's murals. It's the murals that we put up every time one of us is murdered, right? Every time something happens. We don't let our people disappear, right? We talk about saying her name, saying his name, and that's vital. But just visually, in terms of our memory, we don't let our people die. And that, to me, is a critical part of resistance. I don't know how we could be doing this work without it.
Well, I asked that question, and I want to dig a bit deeper into the evidence, that question of evidence. One of the things that I always tell my students, especially with the last class, your feelings aren't scholarship. And what that means is not that your feelings don't matter, but that your feelings are a cardinal direction to tell you sort of where the inquiry means to go. And so I asked that question because when we see these images and we see these photos, they're so strong. And you talked about how when you heard the story of Renisha, it had this very visceral and very physical effect on you. And you sort of talked about, or you did talk about, what it means when someone is murdered, how immediately that is expressed on the tagging. In terms of evidence, because it's not evidence that goes into a court of law, do you think that evidence, it's a way of asserting that these people lived and that they mattered, and that the police or the state is not to be trusted? Or do you think that that's something we project onto what that art could be?
Yeah, I think that it does live on as evidence, and kind of reasserting someone's existence and how much they mattered. Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, so I think, yeah, I think that's exactly what art can do and what artists can do. I think there's a lot of power in that. I think that a lot of that power gets obstructed, unfortunately, by art spaces and institutions, people who are more interested in serving the purpose of the rich and powerful, who are not interested in remembering any of us. So, yeah.
I also wanted to ask you, and you as well, about this idea of invisibility, because it's something that has come up a lot. And it really struck me when you were talking about sort of why Black women as a subject really, it fascinates you, but also your sort of the idea that Black women are everywhere, but they're not seen, and we never look at the other, which is the default status of white men at the top of the hierarchy. Let's see if we can go back to Renisha's photo or drawing. you told me that the grid had a really important symbolism, and I wanted to know if you could talk about the technical aspects of what it meant and why you decided to make that relationship.
Right. Well, just going back to the fact that Theodore Wafer, his defense was that he was afraid for his life. I don't know about you guys, but if I was ever afraid for my life and I was locked inside of my home, I would not open the door. So that's a sorry-ass excuse. He was basically asserting his white male privilege and probably thought he could claim some sort of stand your ground. I mean, it backfired on him somewhat because I think he's serving about 17 years in life, which is not enough, but it is what it is. Anyway, I drew the grid over her because I wanted to have a conversation about how he saw her and how I saw her and how probably a lot of rational people would see her. So I took the portrait that her family released publicly, which is a photograph of her probably from like a high school or something like that. It's okay, go for it. It wasn't bothering me until you looked at me. But I wanted to kind of bring those two things together. And I wanted the public to still see her for who she is, which was a person full of possibilities. And the possibilities that I saw were positive versus what Theodore Wafer saw, which he described he feared for his life. And his view from her and his perspective of her was through a screen door.
And did you want to?
Oh, is it okay if I? Okay, yeah, because I wanted to respond to your question about evidence, because I think evidence is a term that needs to be qualified, right? So we think about evidence for what? Mm-hmm. Evidence for whom, right? So there's evidence in a court of law, right? So if you come to CopWatch training on March 13th, right, you'll learn that one of the roles on a CopWatch patrol is the video person. The video person can say nothing, right? And if you're someone like me, that can be a little bit challenging, right? You're watching this happen the other night, right? We watched, we documented the cops pulling a man out of a wheelchair and dislocating his shoulders. They shackled him, right? If you're on the video saying, yo, you pigs are wild, can't really use that as evidence in one form, right? When I think about murals and when I think about tagging and the ways that people do that, right, it's about the person, right? Evidence that they existed, evidence that they belong to us, but it's also about space, right? Because we're disappeared, right, from a white gaze, but we're also literally physically being disappeared out of our spaces. Right? We're disappeared out of our spaces when we are incarcerated, right? When people are put in the hole, they have no contact, or disappeared out of our communities through gentrification. So all of these different ways. And when we claim space in that way, that's evidence of a kind of politics, right? That people may not consider in that way. People are used to thinking about politics as something you do around elections or something you do around policies, but our existence is inherently political. Our occupation of space is inherently political. And so the way too that these murals and these tags generate activity, right? So, take your selfie, right? Or take a picture with your boo. You want to be in front of the nice looking mural, right? That's putting love or putting some kind of self-love in front of that art. So that's evidence of a sort of political and intellectual life and spirit that doesn't appear in a court of law, right? But I think is very important.
Well, it goes into my next question, which is for you, which is you're someone who in this work, you bear witness in a very explicit way, in a very direct way that is not abstract. And there's also a great bodily risk that comes with that. And so what is it like to, I shouldn't say what is it like, what does it mean to take on those risks of bearing witness in one of the purest ways possible that you can? And what way is art as protest, how does that help your activism?
I mean, it's a good question, right? Because inevitably, especially training people, right? You want to be careful, at least I want to be careful to not embody some sort of problematic machismo. Right? Like, I'm with CopWatch, nothing can happen to me. Oh, yeah, it can. Right? One of our members got charges last month while cop watching. I mean, so that happens. The police can be very escalated. They can be violent.
Do you feel targeted?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. They target cop watchers. They know who we are.
What are some examples of how you can be targeted in doing that work?
Sure. So trying to think of a good example recently. So the day, was it the day of or the day after the last executive orders, the immigration ban, right? A lot of people showed up at JFK. Were any of you there at JFK? Okay. So you might have seen me running around, right? Running perimeter, doing security. The cops notice this, right? And they notice us documenting them, documenting their badge numbers. So when the police decided they were going to start taking some kind of action, they cleared the street, right? And I was there with 2 other cop watchers. We were trying to get people to stay in the street and occupy it, right? But most of the people there maybe have a different kind of politics than we do, let's put it that way, right? And clearly many of them are coming from very different places in the world. So they just obediently cleared the street and ceded that space. Then the cops started building pens, right? So there was a time when they were holding it with their full riot gear. You start to build pens. This white man walks through with coffee for the police, right? A protester. I would like to tell you that I maintained my composure and had a very reasonable conversation with him, but that would be a lie. So what I instead did, documented on camera as evidence, is said something along the lines, in my more typical way of speaking, of, what are you doing bringing coffee to these officers of the law? And he's like, well, they're human beings too. And I said, well, they don't see us that way and they will shoot us. He's like, no, they won't. And I said, no, they will shoot us. They won't shoot you. Right? And at this point, the cops are moving around as if they're going to arrest us. Right? So this dialogue continues. This man said, well, I'm a student of political activism. And he starts talking to me about Steve Biko. I swear to you, it was the most surreal thing I've ever experienced. Right? And so I take one step, and then the cops are there as if I'm going to beat him. Right? So the cops are there protecting him. This happened, again, the day after the election, when a friend and I started a chant in Spanish in front of Trump Towers at that big protest the day after the election. And this man came through and body charged us. Right? He was so angry that we were chanting in Spanish that he charged us. And the cops ran through, targeted us. Right? So that's kind of in the context of protest. We see it in the neighborhood all the time, though, where we just get stopped on the most minute charges. I got stopped for taking my phone out of my bag the other day. Right? I was on a corner, my phone rang. I took it out. It was suspicious. Could have been a weapon. Right? So these kinds of things happen to CopWatch members all the time.
One of the things that we talked about, Oasa and I, when we were kind of preparing for this talk, is thinking about how is art moving in the current movement. And we see this artistic renaissance of spirit and music, particularly with Beyonce's Lemonade and Solange's A Seat at the Table. And there's this consistent movement of that. And also, not to forget Kendrick Lamar's album. But there seems to be a disconnect, I think, the way in which that movement is represented in fine art. And so I think that when, I want to unpack that a bit, sort of what your opinions, both of you, your opinions on that. And sort of my observation is that we're not seeing artists in a consistent and organized way using fine art in its depiction, not necessarily as a commentary to state art, but actual depictions of it. And that's complicated because that it's not, it insinuates that there's an obligation that those artists have to depict that. But there's also, speaking of this heritage of violence that I'm currently working on to put defacement in, that goes back to Goya's Disasters of War, looks at Picasso's Guernica, which is incredibly explicit, looking at Emory Douglas's work with the Black Panther Party, which really gave us this connection and iconography of the police as pigs. We're not seeing that moving in the same way as fine art. And so I kind of wanted to get your opinion on that and what you think, or maybe what I'm missing, and what role the institutions have to play and where they're dropping the ball possibly.
Right. I mean, I think that there are definitely artists that are making the work. I think that, again, their institutions and art spaces are blocking that. A lot of those things from being seen. The problem, I mean, part of the problem is that artists are way too tied to the market. It's kind of this, it's this problem that I think the music world doesn't have in the way that we have it, because it is something that's visual, and it is something, a lot of the times it's something that's actually, like, it's a physical object. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of it has to do with the mentality of artists as well, and wanting to kind of climb the ladder of the art world and making that a priority over the actual content of their work, and actually, you know, being true to themselves as artists. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that art is so institutionalized. I mean, we have to, you know, we have to get our BFAs, and then we have to get our MFAs, and then you have to, you know, God forbid you get the MFA from the wrong place, then you're not on the right track, and then you don't get the opportunities that you feel like you should be able to, you know, that whole story. So I think that because the art world is so white, oh my God, it's so fucking white. And everybody in power, you know, everyone that has that power, they don't want to see that. They don't need a Beyonce. Or Kendrick Lamar. They don't want to hear that. They certainly don't want to buy that. And if they do, they're probably, you know, storing it somewhere. Then no one will ever see it. As where with music, you know, at this point, you can, you know, we're streaming it. And it's just a lot more accessible. I think artists need to start thinking about other ways of working, and working outside of gallery systems and museum systems, and setting some other goals, and working towards something a little more meaningful than personal gain.
Mm-hmm. What do you suggest, Jess?
I mean, I don't know that I have a lot to say about the art world, but, you know, to respond to what you had asked me before and tied in about art as evidence, I think you're exactly right, you know, because even for activists, even for writers, even for musicians, we reproduce this fetishistic cult of individualism, right? So whether that's, you know, wanting to be in the right museums or be on the right track, as you're saying, or like, right? I mean, this whole Asada taught me, you know, I learned from Malcolm, right? There's a lot of ideas from people you've never heard of, right? And a lot of ideas that don't work within a language, whether it's a visual artistic language, a musical language, or an actual language that we're familiar with, right? And so to me, thinking about what it would take to do something different, it would take everyone having a commitment not to do the best by themselves within the system as it is, right? But to create entirely a system where everyone is doing good, right? And not at someone else's expense.
Yeah, I mean, that question of sort of taking, or not that question, but that statement of taking that ownership of what can you do. I think it's an important question to ask, because then it begs the question of, you know, aside removing the institutions, how do you decolonize yourself? And so we've talked, and I think it's important to talk about that, because this is a panel of women of color, and we're talking about organizing, and we're talking about state violence. And I believe that most social justice movements are started and led by women. And we see that with the Black Lives Matter movement. And it's this hard irony because Black women have created this movement, but Black women victims of police brutality are largely absent, which is why I think it's really important that we're visually centering Renisha McBride. But even when we're talking about feminism, we also, I think, have to decolonize those feminist spaces. And we've talked a lot about white feminism and the problems of that, but there's also a lot of problems with women of color. I think we still haven't talked about the fact that I think it's 26% of Latino women voted for Trump. And what does that mean? I don't know the numbers on Asian women. I haven't seen it. But I think that's important to bring up. And I want to ask you guys, what does it mean for you as a woman to be on these front lines? But also, what does it mean, because this issue is such a feminist issue, and I think that you all look at it as a women's issue when we're talking about immigration and the deportation and the Muslim ban. That's women that are going to be left to pick up the pieces of that. But we're also invisible in this space. How do you reconcile, either professionally or personally, that invisibility as a woman on these front lines, but then also this question of the work that feminism needs to do to make this a mainstream women's issue?
Okay, I guess I'm gonna talk a little bit more. I love the sound of my own voice. I think these are important questions. And, I'm thinking back actually to election night, and being, at a little bar with no name in my neighborhood, having a great time with my friend, expecting to deal the next day with a certain kind of liberal smugness, right? An unbearable smugness. And I say this as someone who grew up in the 90s and has a really visceral hatred for all things Clinton, right? I say this as someone who was described in my childhood as a super predator, right? I say this as someone who felt in the most direct ways possible the end of welfare as we know it, right? I experienced all these things before I had the words to know what kind of violence was being done to me and my family and my community. So that was the expectation. And then, at one point we looked up to Univision. We're like, oh, shit, right? What's happening? And so dealing with that and dealing with the very comfortable and easy ways many self-identified feminists, whether Black, whether Latina, whether white, have made this into a, you voted for Trump, you're the problem, right? Where I think about 94% of Black women who voted for Clinton, right, who very rightly are saying we're not the problem. But there's a lot of classism in there, in a lot of ways where I say, yeah, you're very comfortable identifying as not the problem and problematizing us, right? And so, yeah, we got to talk about the 26%, 24%, whatever, of Latina women. I'm guessing most of them live in Florida. I don't know. Shade on the Husanos. But right, we have to have those conversations. We have to have them in really complex ways, right? I think I was at a point earlier in my life where I was very ignorant, and because I had only ever been around poor people, didn't know about classism, right? And then I met the bourgeoisie, and oh my God, right? And I'm still so often in that, oh my God, what's happening moment, right? And so I think that for feminism to do the work that it needs to do as a liberatory position, it needs to be situated in the communities of the most vulnerable. And I mean trans women, I mean sex workers, I mean incarcerated women, I mean women who are undocumented, right? And so for all of us who may be in some of those positions or maybe in none of them, we need to ask ourselves, what are the ideas that these women have about the kind of world we should be creating, and how can we take that direction moving forward, if that makes sense?
Oasa, for you.
I mean, I think a lot about work, and how work is valued and what type of work is valued. Oftentimes, the work that women do is not valued, whether it be sex work or mothering, or any other type of work that we do. It's usually devalued in some way, whether we're not paid for it or we're paid, pennies on the dollar for it. But I think I think there needs to be a change in our common sense. Overall, everybody is human beings of how we look at work, how we look at capitalism and survival, and we need to start questioning how we're working and why we're working and who we're working for and what we're working towards and why the fuck are we doing it 40 plus hours a week. When really that 40 plus hours a week should be spent with our families and our communities, and doing things that are actually meaningful to you rather than wasting it away on building up someone else's business, or any business for that matter, and further suppressing other people. The fact that we're, placing value on our labor, or I should say monetary value on our labor, there's something really wrong with that. And I think until we start looking at those things, we're going to run into these same problems over and over again. I think ultimately all of this started with capitalism and the need to create this power structure and oppress somebody for something or another. And yeah, we need to rethink all of those things.
My next question is that it's two-part. The first part is, do you see trauma as being a part of your work and activism? And so how does it surface?
Yes. And yeah, and I think it shows up in the subject matter, and I think it shows up in the way I apply graphite to paper, the way I interact with my materials, and the energy that goes into it, but more importantly, the content.
Yeah, I mean, trauma is one of those terms that I think I have trouble understanding a little bit, because it suggests some sort of baseline free from that, right? And I'm not saying that everything is this horrible, bleak, grayscale reality all the time, but there's always shadows, right? At least in my own lived experience. So what people call trauma absolutely influences it, right? I mean, it's CopWatching is a strategy to try to reduce trauma in the community, right? And to try to direct that rage that we have because of trauma into doing something to deter it, right? Or to de-escalate it, right? All of those things. But in terms of thinking about political strategy, right? And I think that maybe trauma is something that gives us lights into where we need to press that energy, right? So what does it look like, right? When you're talking about the structures of capitalism, yeah, obviously, right? And I don't think that all the sort of dry Marxism in the world can illuminate what we need to do about that in the same ways that our lived and embodied knowledge can.
Well, I bring up the question of trauma because it's a big part of the Basquiat research that I'm looking at the moment. And I have a question that leads to this. But wait, oops, let me go back. It's this question of, so this idea, trauma tends to be a dismissed feeling, and this dismissed emotion that is, you're just angry, it's irrational, but I think it's really underappreciated, and it really deserves an inquiry. And I ask that because trauma also informs a lot of art, as you were saying, and it also tells us how this art is created. And so for this work, I don't think it's possible to not dissect the idea of trauma. Judith Herman, who's one of the godmothers of modern and contemporary trauma theory, she states that trauma, to offer a definition, that trauma is a reaction in an attempt to survive a violent encounter. And so if you take that as kind of a very rudimentary definition of trauma, she also says that victims of trauma or people who've encountered it tend to rework the event over and over, whether that's by repeating those kind of repeating the events or getting close to repeating it. So if you grew up with abuse, you tend to repeat that, hoping to find a more livable or pleasant end game. And so the reason why I say that is because when we're looking at this painting, if we look at defacement as just by itself, it looks like a one-off. But if we look at this painting also as another conversation about defacement and Michael Stewart's death, then it starts engaging that idea of repeating the work over and over again, and trying to rework it in a way that doesn't result in Michael Stewart's murder, or a way of reclaiming that dignity that was taken from him when he was murdered. So I ask that, or I preface all of that to say, in art, when you're working with these faces and you're having to get really detailed and doing it over and over again, is that, and this may be a difficult question, but does that further traumatize, or is that healing, or is it kind of a mix of both? And for you, kind of going out again, doing the CopWatch over and over again, and knowing that the chances, you literally have a greater chance of being struck by lightning than a cop being indicted or convicted of a murder. Where does that situate, this idea of trauma and reworking it, and then, also being hopeful too?
For me, when I'm drawing a portrait, let's say if it's of Renisha, or I remember drawing a portrait of Michael Brown as well, a lot of the times I'm thinking a lot about their family members and how they saw them versus how I'm seeing them as someone who doesn't know them, but I'm copying their image, and wanting to respect everything that their loved ones notice about them. There are things that I notice on my children, or my husband, or another loved one, that someone who isn't familiar with them or their bodies may not notice it, whether it's, a hair that sticks out from their eyebrow a certain way, or something really difficult or easy to kind of look past on their face, and really wanting to respect that and honor the way their loved ones might know them. So I do, it is like a form of meditation when I'm drawing someone's portrait, and wanting to respect that. And then also when I'm drawing, I drew a portrait of Darren Wilson for my series of White Men, and I was thinking the whole time, I'm gonna draw the shit out of you, you piece of, garbage, and all of these other things. I was thinking, so the energy was definitely different when I was making that work. What was going into it.
Yeah, I mean, that was a interesting and provocative definition of trauma, I think, because for many of us who are cop watchers, right, there's something re-traumatizing about us. Many of us have had these kinds of encounters in our own lives, and then we're willfully placing ourselves again and again in this position, and it's not, you don't forget about anything you see, it doesn't blur out, it doesn't blur away. But I'm thinking about this quality of repetition in the way that you were talking about trauma, and thinking about, a conversation we were having earlier about all the hashtags, right? And people becoming hashtags. And it's like Freddie Gray and, Deborah Danner, and, right? So many names that you can't remember, right? So Marley Graham, Mohammed Ba, all these names. It's like, who, wait, what? Oscar Grant, oh my God, him too, right? And it just keeps going, and it just keeps going. And I think that there's two things that can happen from that. So we can get numb to it, and just like, oh my God, again, we lose the eyebrow hair that sticks out at the crazy angle, right? Or the way that you always have some sort of shadow on your lip, or, whatever. We can lose that, and by doing so, we lose them again and again and again. So that's re-traumatizing. But also sometimes in searching for that, we can fall into what I think is really problematic respectability politics, right? So there's always this need, when you hear the narratives about those of us who are murdered, there's always this need for us to be the perfect victims, right? We were never doing anything, right? It was always, and I understand that impulse, but that ends up creating sort of echoing, dominoing traumas, right? So I'm thinking about Kadim Torres. Are y'all familiar with Kadim? So Kadim was murdered in East New York over the weekend by the police, 17-year-old boy. And he was murdered. They say that the cops were intervening in a gang incident, right? That he was going to retaliate for some other killing, and there's all kinds of details that seem really crazy, right? That he fired and fired and fired again, but they found him with a .32, which is a revolver, right? It has 6 rounds in it, and he was running. A lot of things that seem crazy, right? But the reason you don't know him, the reason he's not a hashtag, is he's not a perfect victim, right? He's a 17-year-old boy, right, who had involvement in gangs. So it's like, oh, well, maybe he deserved it. So sometimes I think that in trying to escape trauma for ourselves, we traumatize other kinds of people, right? The fact that there's just complete radio silence about this, and I've been monitoring this very closely all weekend and this week. Kadim Torres, right? So I don't know if that makes sense, a response.
We have time for one more question, and I wanted to leave on or ask this question on this note, the last note. What do you think the role of art is in this movement? And when you combine art and politics, what are some of the results that can be used to help find a way through this oppression, and be able to live through it, and stay sane?
I don't know. Is that a good response? I don't know. Like I said, I don't know what to do, so I make a drawing. I don't know what to do, so I go outside with my neighbors. And like I said, when Mildred and I first started doing the public programming, we had no idea how meaningful it would be to us and to our community. But if we didn't do it, if we didn't try, we wouldn't have known. So I think that a lot of the answers that we need to be answered, we need to start searching first internally and then outwardly, and not just for self-gain, but more so to build community with the people around you. I think you can do that with art.
And just to piggyback off of what you said, to me as someone who doesn't create visual art, writers, musicians, dancers, artists, filmmakers, photographers, right? These are all manifestations of our imagination, right? And so it doesn't, to me I always say that I define politics as relationship of power between 2 or more people. Right? So there's a politics that's so important to me when I see you and those kids weaving stuff into that bridge, right? When you're out there fixing the crop top, on the sidewalk. And that to me reveals a doorway of possibility that's so important. And that, this isn't to discredit words, but there's something about artists' work that I think can help us dream a different world than the one we're living in right now, and that's important to me.
Yeah, absolutely. You're totally right about that. That it is the role of the artist or creative people in general to kind of reimagine the possibilities. Someone told me or wrote to me the other day that our government there's never going to be reparations from our government for enslavement. And we need to start thinking of alternatives to that, of how to do that. And that sounds great at first, but then I thought that was too limiting, to decide that our government will never get the reparations that we're due. I think that it's important to imagine and reimagine everything. That's the one thing they can't take from us in a sense, is our ability to reimagine the future and to reinvent it. And I think that, you know, that needs to be our focus, at least some of the times for some of the things.
All right. I think on that note, I just want to thank you guys very much.